Teardown, the indie darling heist and destruction game, has finally made its way to current gen consoles, with it having released simultaneously on Xbox Series consoles and PlayStation 5, where it is available for free with a PS Plus subscription right now. If you do not know what this game's all about and why we were enamored with it at Digital Foundry, let me tell you a bit about it. Teardown is a very unique game from the DF perspective, as it is doing rendering and simulation that are genuinely rare to see in games, and it's why I covered the work in progress version of the game around 3 years ago on PC in 2020. Like some of the most iconic games in the last 30 years, the core tech behind Teardown is the main enabler of its gameplay systems, and it's pretty fascinating how it works. At the core of the game are the voxels, the little bricks that make up the game world in Teardown. It gives the game its lo-fi, hi-fi aesthetic, where each and every object in the game has a deformed Lego-esque look to it. All the detail is made up of blocky bits, arranged into recognizable shapes that you just intuitively understand. A dump truck? Yep. A car? Yep. A palm tree? Why not? Those voxels, though, are not a purely aesthetic thing in this game. They drive how the game is rendered and how it is played. Each voxel, when combined together into these shapes, has different weighted constraints and material properties, so different objects react differently to physical forces. Some, like wood, come apart into tiny pieces really easily with the swing of your hammer, while others, like metals, are more robust and require more violent or explosive treatment to break apart. The way these different materials react forms the core gameplay loop where you destroy and manipulate the voxel environment in the game to achieve some goal. In the single-player campaign, it can be a simple goal, such as wrecking a given house the quickest you can. A bit like Blast Corps, if you ever played that, where your choice of destructive implement is key to getting the best score in time. Or the gameplay can be more complex. For example, here in this mission, you have to rapidly disconnect 3 security systems in different parts of the map before the timer runs out. But the catch is that these security systems are separated by walls, stairs, and a lot of traversable distance. So you have to use the game's voxel-based physics system to make a solution where you can get out in time while turning off all the security systems. So you knock down the walls brick by brick, demolish the things that are in the way, and set up some stackables to make some new routes to manage a quick escape. Essentially, it is a game where the physics drive the gameplay beat, and a lot of the fun can be just seeing it all unfold in front of you with the unique physics systems that are there, such as fire. Wood objects can easily catch fire in the game when subjected to heat or explosions. There's an entire propagation system where the fire will spread to other flammable objects. It's neat to look at and interact with, and that is partially due to the stellar rendering of that fire here. The smoke and flame from the fire is volumetric and physicalized in its own right, so you can see the smoke snake its way through a building that is on fire. And you will see it collate in those areas where it gets trapped, like in the ceilings or the corners of buildings. And if you apply some force to it, you can see the smoke realistically be pushed around and collide with other things. The smoke, fire, and other volumetric effects in this game just look right, more so than you would see in less stylized games. Most other games would use just 2D textures that face the camera and are more or less static, so purely visual. Yet here in Teardown, there's an entire physicalized system that is fully built into the gameplay, and it even looks quite a bit better than most AAA games, I would say. The voxel physics are just one half of the game's uniqueness technically. The other half is how the rendering is achieved with those voxels. Teardown's primary visuals are achieved by intensive voxel tracing, and very little standard rasterization techniques are used here. So a lot of things in the game have a ray-traced quality to them. Take reflections, for example. If you look at any glossy or semi-glossy surface, you can see how there are very accurate reflections in them, and importantly, appear even when they're off screen. That is because the game ray marches specular occlusion to make a kind of darkened reflection on objects that is very realistic. This technique, which does not use hardware ray tracing, makes it so that objects rarely look like they're glowing and out of place. But as a concession to make it fast, reflections only get color via screen space information. So if you move the camera up and down, you can actually see how a reflection will lose its color, becoming gray toned, and then regaining it when the reflected object is back in screen space. You can see what is actually being traced against when you look at perfect mirrors, such as this glass frame here. You can see how the world being ray marched against is kind of deformed and has some slight hatches in it due to the ray march steps being used. It's pretty awesome to see. This ray marching achieves the rest of the lighting effects in the game, such as ambient occlusion, which gives the voxel world a kind of pleasing shaded look in those areas that are just lit by the sky, for example. One thing that the game does not do is full-on global illumination. So here, for example, although there is a bright light outside this garage door, you cannot see any of that bright light bouncing around locally at the garage door entrance. So there are some concessions here to make the game performant on all platforms, such as not having global illumination, but the game still looks great, as I said earlier. And on PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X, the game is surprisingly high res in spite of the amount of tracing that is going on. In the fidelity mode on Xbox Series X and PlayStation 5, they run the game at 1620p. So half the total pixel resolution of 4K, and the game is targeting 60 FPS there. Based upon comparisons with the PC, I would also say that Xbox Series X and PS5 also run the game at the highest graphical quality, which is nice to see. The Series S in comparison runs the game at 864p in my measurements in the single mode that it has, so there's no choice of performance or fidelity mode here. It also runs the game at the highest quality possible, as you can see on PC, although it will be hard to tell due to the resolution gulf there. On PS5 and Series X, the game looks suitably high res in its fidelity mode with the common 60 FPS update. The gaps between frames tend to be small enough so that aliasing is kept usually to a minimum, and there's only a bit of specular lighting aliasing being an issue for the TAA in the game. The Series S, though, is quite different. As I said, there's only one mode to play in, no quality or performance, and at 864p, I think it's rather blurry and a bit rough looking. And in movement, you can often see a kind of grainy, unstable look in spite of a 60 FPS target. PS5 and Series X also have a performance mode, which runs internally at 1080p and looks alright. I mean, it's obviously noticeably soft on a 4K display, but I think 1080p is just enough pixel resolution for this game's art so that it usually does not look as artifact filled, for example, as what you might see on Series S. The performance mode by default targets 60 FPS, or in the options you can unlock it up to 120 FPS with this option here on Series X and PlayStation 5. So what about the performance though with these two modes? Which one should you choose on Series X and PS5? On PS5, the fidelity mode is pretty interesting actually. Like I said, it is rather high res for a game that has so much tracing going on. And in this footage here, you should notice how the FPS is rather flat at 60 in spite of the high resolution. This is mighty impressive, and I would say 60 FPS is achieved rather well when you do basic voxel manipulation in the game, or just walk around the various environments you can go through. But when you start getting to more intense destruction and the smoke and fire starts filling the screen, that's when the frame rate will start to dip, usually in the upper 40s in moments of medium levels of destruction intensity. Though if you use the game's sandbox modes or other gameplay types where you have more ridiculous destructive tools at hand, you probably could dip that frame rate even lower. In the 1080p performance mode though, those areas where the fidelity mode is dipping below 60 FPS run perfectly fine at 60 FPS. This makes sense as the game is probably very GPU limited and you're cutting the total res in half here, which aids a lot of that performance. Really, in performance mode, I imagine you would struggle to find any drop below 60 FPS, but you are sacrificing the resolution to do that. So I find the performance mode most interesting on PS5 when you can unlock it up to the 120 FPS option. In your average low-intensity voxel manipulation in this game, or just running around the environment, you'll see a really smooth 120 FPS, with only little minor one-off frames dropping here or there. I don't think it's a great concern. It's only when you start engaging with the greater destruction that the performance will buckle a bit, dipping to around the 100 FPS line, usually when you do something more intense. But I still think that is a reasonable frame rate given what is happening on screen here. So on PS5, I would say give each mode a try, but if you want the greatest stability, do the performance mode at 60 or 120 FPS. If you want the greatest resolution and graphics, then you can go for the fidelity mode, which I use to capture all the B-roll in this video here on PlayStation 5. When the frame rate drops in that fidelity mode, you can imagine it's like an older game from a previous generation, and that lower frame rate is kind of selling you the spectacle of everything you're doing. Unfortunately, the answer of which mode to use is not a good one on Xbox Series X, and that is not because the game runs worse there or something in the typical way, rather because the game uses a different type of VSync on Xbox Series X. On PlayStation 5, triple buffered VSync is used, so when the frame rate dips in the 120Hz mode or in that fidelity mode, the overall frame rate will go down to the max that the GPU can actually manage in that moment. It will introduce judder as frame update itself becomes purposefully uneven, but it will have an overall more smooth look to it, I would say, than it otherwise might have, and you're going to be maxing out the console's potential in that moment, with more consistent controller response. On Xbox Series X, double buffered VSync is used, which looks like this. Whenever the frame time even slightly exceeds the threshold for VSync, then the entire frame rate locks down to 30 FPS in that fidelity mode, which gives the game an extremely uneven presentation, and it makes it feel stuttery and weird and almost broken whenever the frame rate cannot hold up. This also applies to the 120Hz performance mode, so that will go down to a straight 60 FPS in moments where the frame rate cannot be a perfect 120. In my opinion, this is a big oversight for the Series X, and the developers need to fix it as soon as possible, and they should implement triple buffering like found on the PlayStation 5 version, and of course, I have informed the developers of my findings. At the moment for Xbox Series X players, I recommend using VRR to alleviate the issue here, which you can see in this off-screen footage where instead of the performance buckling down to 60 or 30, depending upon the mode, it has gradual degradations in the refresh rate there, and you can see in the bottom of the screen. So VRR on Xbox Series X will completely sidestep the double buffering issue as far as I can tell. But if you have a standard display, I can only recommend the performance mode without that 120 FPS unlock on Xbox Series X. That is the only way to otherwise get a consistent performance experience here until a patch solves the issue. On Series S, thankfully, there are much better things to report. It may have double buffering for all I know, like Series X, but it seems to hit 60 FPS really no matter what is thrown at it in my experience, most likely due to its very low resolution here. So on Series S, you do get great and stable performance in this game, although it will be rather blurry and noisy. Coming to the end of this video here, I really think the port of Teardown to consoles is largely a success, and the game still plays great here on a controller, looks great, and it also loads really quickly on all platforms. So you can get in and out of gameplay very quickly without much downtime. On PS5 especially, they give you a great choice of how the game looks and performs, and I like that a lot. But if you go over to Xbox Series X, you can see the issues I just talked about. The performance there is really poor at the moment due to the usage of double buffered VSync, and it really makes me wonder how that snuck into the launch, as it's really obvious that something is wrong the first time you play the game there. Beyond fixing the VSync on Xbox, I would like to see some smaller tweaks to the game. For one, it would be great to have an option for inverted camera controls here, as a number of people like myself play the game that way, and it's something that is lacking at the moment. Another thing I would like to see, but is more unrealistic, would be native HDR, as the game currently doesn't have it, not even on PC, and that would definitely help the graphical presentation here. But other than those issues, Teardown is currently highly recommendable on Series S and PlayStation 5, and hopefully with a patch, it will be very recommendable soon on Xbox Series X. And with that being said, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did enjoy it, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. If you're already a subscriber, hit that little bell in the corner to be informed as soon as Digital Foundry posts a video. Support DF on Patreon to enable more content like this in the future. Write a comment below, follow on Twitter, and as always, this is Alex bidding you farewell und auf Wiedersehen.